Well, your textbook crams a lot of history into the beginning of this chapter. I felt almost like I was back teaching AP European history. And I wish we had more time for regular history, but since I've already devoted more than we can probably spare to the impact of gunpowder, I'm going to race through other political developments and focus how they affected art. We will be talking about the other great invention, printing press, today as well. So at the end of the 15th century, the great centers of Renaissance art, that would be Flanders in the north and Florence in the south, fell prey to expanding national empires, really nation states. Even Rome was invaded by both France and the Holy Roman Empire. Spain, enriched by gold from the New World, became Europe's wealthiest power. And we'll see the artistic consequences of that in the next couple of units. Italian city-states were mostly swallowed up by larger states, although the Italians continued to paint and sculpt, especially for church patrons. Meanwhile, the commercial revolution continued apace as wealthy merchants took advantage of expanding now worldwide trade, of new inventions, and of the reintroduction of a money economy. We've talked about all that before. But the base of patronage continued to expand. The church still commissioned a lot of art, at least until the Protestants grew suspicious of church decoration, when church patronage fell off in the north. But a rising middle class clamored for portraits, for landscapes, and for still life and genre paintings, or that is, paintings of everyday life. Increasingly powerful kings likewise restored the importance of court patronage, especially in Spain, France, and England. And again, we'll see more of that in the next unit. Since we're going to be exploring contrasts between Northern and Southern and Catholic and Protestant Europe in this unit and the next, let me first sound a warning note. There were many common elements between the Italian and Northern Renaissances. Yes, classical learning revived first in Italy, but Greek texts traveled north quickly, especially to the Low Countries, what are now Holland and Belgium. Humanism led to a much stronger focus on individual achievement from Bruges to Naples. Artists, for example, began signing their work and in some cases attracting a following in both regions. Italians and Northern Europeans alike clamored for portraits, although this genre became more important and popular in the north, and the portraits took on a slightly different look. Remember that the Italian portraits tended to be profile, in northern portraits increasingly the subject looked out at the viewer. Christian narratives remained central in both life and art. Interest in scientific discovery and exploration of nature inspired artists in both Italy and the north. Leonardo da Vinci, whom we've already studied, and Albrecht Durer, whom we'll encounter in a big way today, both recorded the natural world on canvas and with copious notes and drawings. But yes, there were important differences, and the College Board is more likely to hone in on those differences when they're asking questions about this period. So I talked about the two Renaissances a little in my last lecture. Since it's important, let me recap now. The Italians drew more heavily on pagan classical sources, and their art more often depicted mythological scenes. The recovery of Greek learning took a more Christian turn in the north, where scholars focused especially on translating and interpreting the Greek New Testament. Churches commissioned art in both regions. Remember, we're talking Renaissance, not Reformation. But Italian art more blatantly served a papal agenda. In Northern Europe, religious life was becoming more personal and devotional, in part because many Northerners were unhappy with what they saw as corrupt Italian popes. So this was the time of all those Medici and Borgia popes and their constant wars and expensive building projects. Northern painters also embraced a more naturalistic, detailed, and yet interestingly symbolic approach to their subject. So ordinary objects, a hand towel or oranges on a ledge, often signaled important religious meanings. This doctrine is sometimes called the sanctification of sight, which emphasized how God's hand and purpose was revealed in the smallest, simplest elements of his creation. But one reason Northern painters loved to capture clothing textures and reflective light and tiny details of domestic spaces is because they could. And that in turn is because they developed and had access to oil paint. So here you see two famous and I think wonderful paintings, Fra Angelico's Annunciation and Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini Marriage. That one has a lot of different titles, by the way. So they're both exquisite works, but you can see how oils create a very different effect. Specifically, oil's slow drying time let painters add a lot more detail, and it let them correct more errors. By applying paint in very thin layers, painters could achieve deeper and more accurate portrayal of surfaces, texture, and light, especially reflected light. And oil produced deeper, richer, yet more subtle gradations of color. Well, even though this chapter is entitled The Age of Reformation, the first work that we're going to examine is very Catholic and therefore serves as a useful contrast to Protestant work. So the two towering figures of the German Renaissance are the Catholic Mattias Grunewald and the Protestant, or in his late life, Protestant Albrecht Durer. I'm going to begin with Grunewald. Mattias Grunewald, and that probably wasn't his real name, by the way, was court painter to the Archbishop of Mainz and created this altarpiece for a monastic order in Isenheim. The altarpiece was placed in the choir of a church that was adjacent to the hospital, which is why it features the saints associated with disease and healing, especially St. Anthony, who was the patron saint of the order, and why its narrative message hones in both on the miraculous healings and on the danger of ignoring God's judgment and maybe not getting healed. Grunewald was a master of the new oil medium, and so as you look at his work, pay attention to how he uses color subtly to model his figures and shockingly to create these really dramatic contrasts between good and evil, the saved and the damned, the alive and the dead. So here what you see is the closed altarpiece. It's actually now in an old church, but a different one. It's about, I think, 20 miles away from its original. It was hauled out by Napoleon soldiers. You also see its predella, and you need to know that term. It'll show up again on this test, a question you've seen before. So the closed altarpiece has images of St. Anthony and St. Sebastian on either wing, portrayed really as painted sculpture. Look at those bases. Note, too, that John the Baptist appears on the other side of the cross from Mary and St. John. In the biblical narrative, of course, John the Baptist is already dead at the time of the crucifixion, but Grunewald has him symbolically present, pointing to the salvation that he had proclaimed to the world was coming. Notice, too, the symbolic lamb holding the cross. And these are among the elements that mark this out as a Catholic work. Protestants did not generally portray non-biblical saints, and they tended to be persnickety about scriptural details and less inclined to symbolism and to sacra conversazione, or to the extent that they used symbolism, it was more often symbolism of ordinary objects. So on the predella, we see Mary and her dead son, which is a pietà just after a deposition. Those are terms you need to know. The closed altarpiece represents one of the most vivid and gruesome depictions of the Calvary in art history. So let's go quickly to two close-ups, first of Christ's head and then of his body, and you'll understand why I say this. The hospital specialized in diseases of the skin and ergotism, which is a disease caused by rye infected with fungal, and it produced really horrible symptoms. And here we see Christ afflicted not only by the wound in his side, by a ravaging skin disease. I know I've shown you this German Gothic image several times, but note how similar the expressive and emotional qualities of this work are to Grunewald's altarpiece. I could easily imagine the College Board pairing these two works. And this emotional and physical, almost exaggeration view will continue to appear in German art even into the 20th century. Stay tuned for Expressionism, one of my favorite periods. So this is how the altarpiece would have appeared open. Now the scenes from left to right are the Annunciation, a concert of angels, notice all those musical instruments of the time, the Nativity, and finally on the right, the Resurrection. This is a computer-aided reconstruction, by the way. The piece is now displayed in that museum in its separate part. So hooray for Photoshop. Let's focus in for a moment on the extraordinary depiction of the resurrection, a scene that relatively few painters have attempted to capture. Note that the soldiers have tumbled down. The resurrection has basically knocked them over. And, of course, the extraordinary use of color and that halo of light that surrounds the resurrected Christ. Now, here's the second interior sequence of the Isenheim altarpiece. The sculpture in the center is not by Grunewald. It was completed 20 years earlier. But note, that's wood covered with gilt, and it reflects this extraordinary tradition of wood carving in Germany. You saw one example of that all too quickly in my last lecture. The two paintings by Grunewald on either side show the meeting of St. Paul the Hermit and St. Anthony on the left and the temptation of St. Anthony in the desert on the right. Now, this meeting of Paul and Anthony comes from the Golden Legend, which you may recall was a medieval source that served as the source of many stories about Mary's early life that were painted by Giotto and others. So this is an extra biblical source and therefore unlikely to show up in a Protestant work. But it's the right-hand wing that's so striking. This is St. Anthony being tempted in the desert, and these are really impressive demons. Again, notice what vivid, really extraordinary colors, but also gradations oil painting can produce. I'm going to talk about the truly weird Hieronymus Bosch in the next and final lecture for this unit, but I thought I'd share a couple of images from his Temptation of St. Anthony, which isn't in your book and won't be in my next lecture. I've now written your test, by the way, and I'll tell you that the College Board likes you to be able to identify the painter who did weird, fantastical scenes, often of hell and damnation. You're not going to have any trouble with these, I predict. Hieronymus Bosch is hard to forget. Here is another image from the Bosch triptych about the Temptation of St. Anthony. This is truly weird. Okay, back to the less weird, but frankly more significant in terms of art history. So I began my discussion of the Northern Renaissance with one invention that transformed society, and that was gunpowder. The invention that more than any other ushered in our next period, the Reformation, was the printing press. It not only spread knowledge and incendiary ideas, but it also created new markets for art in forms that could be reproduced and therefore created new types of art. So here's the first major book printed with movable type in Europe, the Gutenberg Bible, in German, by the way, which was very significant. Although illustrated Bibles with woodcuts would soon follow, these illuminations were actually added by hand. So this is kind of an amalgam, if you will, of the new technology and the old. Now, I'd like you to take a break from my disembodied voice to watch two video clips, one real short, one a little longer. It's from one of my favorite history video series, which I used to inflict on my AP Euro students, The Day the Universe Changed with James Burke. So the first short clip talks about life before the printing press. The second, longer clip offers an excellent introduction, not only to printing, but to the Protestant Reformation. And in fact, I'm not really going to talk about the Protestant Reformation. This clip and the clip from the Khan Academy are what I'm relying on as your lectures on this topic. Trust me, he's more fun and more interesting than I am. So I really hope you watched the Khan Academy podcast on printmaking and that you're going to see another video on that in a minute. This is one of these topics that is really better shown than talked about. And so again, take the time to watch that video. Basically though, printed art in this period was produced in one of two ways. The first is a wood block, which is produced by carving out everything that isn't going to print. Here we see a wood block illustration added to a book. Each color had to be printed separately, by the way. The image also had to be carved in reverse because it was the negative that printed. So here's a woodblock print that was created by the most famous print artist of all time, probably the most famous German painter as well, Albrecht Durer. Note that while Durer would become a Lutheran, this dates from before Luther nailed his theses to the wall in 1517. Later, Durer would continue to illustrate the lives of saints, but his late works focused more on strictly biblical sources. So I've included this woodblock print, which isn't in your book, because I think it illustrates the constraints that wood placed, even on as masterful a woodblock artist as Durer. It's harder to create tiny, intricate, or crossed lines, cross-hatching with wood. And therefore, woodcuts tend to be somewhat simpler. Here, by contrast, is an engraving made by carving lines into a metal plate with an instrument called a burin. You saw a picture of that on today's quiz. Note the much more subtle gradations of volume and light that you can create by cross-hatching or crossing parallel lines. By the way, I just realized that I made a goof. I was going to include still one more slide, and you have a lot, as you see, on another form of engraving, which is called etching, which is done by burning acid into plates that are drawn on much more lightly. We're going to hit a lot of etchings later on in this course, and so I will talk about etchings. Then, for now, just know that that's another form of engraving, not of woodcut. So here's an example of engraving from your book. It's a very famous example of engraving. And this process is called intaglio, where the image is carved and then ink is forced into the grooves, and then the mirror image is printed. You saw that on the video. Like many engravers, Schongauer was trained as a goldsmith because the skills transferred well. This point should be obvious, but the College Board expects you to know it anyway. The huge advantage of printmaking and the reason it transformed art was that artists could make multiple copies. But here's a concept that sometimes confuses students, and for that matter, people who are buying art. Prints produced from the original engraving, usually in a limited number, or the original woodcut, I should say, are called print originals. You can tell them because they're slightly raised. You can see where the printing press pressed down on the paper. In fact, you have to use wet paper for the engravings. But when these images are copied by some other means, such as photo offset printing, what you have is a reproduction. Trust me, if you had an original Schongauer or Durer print, even if the artist printed off hundreds of these originally, you would be a very wealthy person. By the way, if you're detecting a St. Anthony theme, it was popular in a Europe that was still experiencing deadly waves of the plague. So this print actually shows 9 different demons or temptations assailing St. Anthony. He really plays on our fears of insects, doesn't he? Note that like Grunewald and Bosch, he combines animal and human characteristics in a very odd way to portray his demons. By the way, Michelangelo was so taken by this work that he copied it into his own sketchbooks. Well, I'm going to have more to say about Durer, but first I'd like you to watch one last pretty short video segment, which is on the printing press, which is actually talking about the printing of visual images. So it's actually the section in many ways most relevant to this course. What would you guess, by the way? Is this a woodblock or an intaglio engraving? It's a woodblock, and you should be able to tell by the strong, straight lines. It's very hard to carve a curve into wood. It's also hard to produce very fine lines. On the other hand, you'll notice that this artist did manage some cross-hatching. Okay, on to Albrecht Durer, and he is really one of our superstars. He's the Northern Renaissance and Reformation Leonardo da Vinci. He, too, was the son of an apprentice of a goldsmith, but as a teenager, he turned to making woodcuts for the new booming publishing industry. It's a little bit like, going into software engineering or something. It was the hot new field. Durer was a humanist scholar. He was a mathematician, he was a scientist, and by the way, he was a superbly skilled publicist who, partly with the help of his wife, who was his marketing director, actually made some serious money from his art. Durer made 2 trips to Italy, one early in his life, one a little later, and at the time he made friends with many of our Italian high Renaissance superstars, including, for example, Raphael. So he helped bring Italian Renaissance mathematical perspective, humanist learning, painting and drawing techniques, sculpture back to Germany and to the north. Nevertheless, Durer remains a very northern figure, especially when he embraces Protestantism in the last decade of his life. So here are 2 self-portraits, very striking. So do you remember this print from your book's introductory chapter? Amazingly enough, this is a woodcut, not an engraving. It has hundreds and hundreds of individually carved lines. The carving, by the way, would mostly be done by a skilled craftsman who worked from the artist's drawings. In fact, the drawings were placed right on top of the block of the wood, so they were destroyed in the process. We do know, however, that Durer sometimes did his own carving. The theme of this comes from the book of Revelation, and the 4 disasters are death, famine, war, and pestilence. Death, you may recall, is the emaciated old man. Famine is swinging the scales that will weigh human souls. War wields a sword, and pestilence draws a bow. This engraving, not a woodcut of Adam and Eve, by contrast, highlights Durer's extraordinary skills as an engraver. Again, cross-hatching is the use of perpendicular lines, or crossing lines, I should say, to convey volume and modeling. Note, too, how Durer uses animal symbols to represent the four humors, or temperaments. Here you see Adam grasping the tree of life, and that plaque hanging from the branch is an inscription that basically indicates that Durer is the author. It's in Latin, showing his humanist training. The nudes also reflect the Italian influence on Durer's work. There were not a lot of nudes in Northern works. Most Northern Renaissance and certainly most Reformation works put clothes on their people. Durer was also influenced by classical sculpture, and like Michelangelo, he based his Adam on the ancient sculpture of Apollo Belvedere. He's adopted the contrapposto stand too, although you'll see it's reversed in the print. That is from the Apollo Belvedere. So here's another very famous Durer engraving. I don't think this one is in your book, but I've included it to show Durer's mastery of showing perspective and his ability to use engraving to depict both light and interior space. Sorry, this is a little blurry, but it's one of his most famous engravings. So, is this a woodcut or an engraving? Actually, again, it's a woodcut. You can kind of tell it by the stronger, bolder, and more far apart lines, but Durer is so skilled, it's almost hard to tell. This, too, shows the artist's ability to convey perspective and interior space, but it's also significant because it reveals Durer's conversion to Lutheran Protestantism. Luther rejected transubstantiation, or the bread and wine transforming into the actual body and blood of Christ, so Durer has put the bread and wine off to the side here. While we're on the Reformation theme, this is in your book. It's a woodcut illustrating the difference between Protestant and Catholic notions of salvation in a way that is not fair or kind to Catholic teaching. Luther believed that the Christians are saved by faith or God's free grace alone. Catholics believed, and in fact still believe, that salvation comes both through faith and through good works. And you know what an allegory is, right? It means using symbols or narrative to convey hidden meaning. What's really important to note here is the way simple, even propagandistic woodcuts help disseminate Protestant beliefs. Actually, they help disseminate a lot of things, as you saw in the video, including scientific learning. Eventually, as we will see in the next unit, the Catholic Church uses art very effectively to fight back. I'm surprised this isn't in your book, but this is one of Cranach's many portraits of Martin Luther. Back to Durer. Here are two more famous Durer engravings, just to help you identify them. He's a College Board favorite, and deservedly so. In particular, The Night, the Death, and the Devil, because it's in most of the art history books, could show up on an AP exam, although I don't think it's on the exam that you're going to take next week. So here we see another side of Durer's extraordinary drawing and painting skills, his interest in natural science, and again, he's extraordinarily accurate and careful in his renderings. I think this is actually very interesting work. Now, this painting reveals not only Durer's skills as a portraitist, but again, also his Reformation theology and the heavy influence of high Renaissance Italian painting on Durer's works. I mean, if someone were to tell me this was a Raphael, it wouldn't surprise me. Note, however, that St. John really overshadows St. Peter. You probably would not see that in a Catholic painting. And those keys held over the Bible suggest that the key to the kingdom isn't the papacy, it's the scripture, another teaching of Luther. By the way, the inscription on the bottom, which you can't possibly read, and I don't read German anyway, is actually a warning against false prophets. And the warning is being issued against Protestants, not Lutherans, but some of the more radical Protestant groups that were cropping up in Germany right now. Very interesting history that I don't have time to tell you about. But note that Durer spent most of his life as a Catholic, and while he was now a Lutheran, he remained a conservative Protestant. Luther, by the way, also did not like these radical groups, many of whom, by the way, were promoting rebellion against princes and more what we probably now consider socialist teachings. And here, this close-up will just give you a better sense of Durer as a portraitist. And again, I think this could easily be an Italian Renaissance work. Note that not all Protestants would share Durer's conservatism or his love of religious imagery. Radical Protestants in particular found images idolatrous. Their churches, as we'll see in the next unit, were much, much simpler. And sometimes Protestant mobs would actually destroy great works of art in a fit of religious zeal. So on the right, you see a depiction of radical Protestants looting Zurich churches in 1562. The image on the left you've seen before, back from Unit 5 when we studied the Byzantines. So you need to know that term. Iconoclasm is back, and therefore so are the AP College Board questions on iconoclasm. Hint, hint. Just a few more quick images. Whew. This period also witnessed a growing interest in landscapes and in historical paintings, particularly on a very large scale. Again, we'll see more of those in the next unit. But this depiction of Alexander the Great's defeat of Darius was painted when the Holy Roman Empire was in a life and death struggle with the Ottoman Turks. They came very close to capturing Western Europe, as close, in fact, as the gates of Vienna. The phrase bird's eye view should be self-explanatory. We'll see more of these. So Holbein was a famous artist, famous portraitist, and he's especially known for his portraits of Henry VIII. I'm going to end with one of those in a moment. But what's really neat about this painting is that anamorphic image. That strange shape on the bottom only reveals itself as a skull when you view the painting from the side. Very neat. There are all sorts of other symbolism in this work. It's well discussed in your book. I'm running out of time, but it's one I could imagine the College Board using, both because it's famous, because there are a lot of interesting questions you could ask about it. And here is one of the many Hans Holbein Henry VIII portraits. Whew, we have gotten through a lot of material. In my final lecture, I'm going to head for the Netherlands and the weird world of Hieronymus Bosch and the wonderful, cluttered, full of life world of Pieter Bruegel and his family.